Thanks be to God. Metro Baptist, it is good to be with you this morning. I thank you for the invitation. I'm glad that over the past nearly decade, QC Family Tree and our work has occasionally overlapped with you. We've been visitors. We've had some of the same staff people between us and that sort of thing. And I'm grateful for the work that you all do and your faithfulness in doing it. So the scripture that you've heard read this morning is often called the parable of the tenants or the parable of the wicked tenants. But I want to preach to you this morning from the subject, the parable of the absentee landlord. And so with that in mind, I offer you these reflections. In January of 1960, Martin Waters of the Waters Insurance and Realty Company here in Charlotte, North Carolina, stood before Charlotte City Council to make one last plea to stop urban renewal. The council was set to vote that night after a decade of starts and stops to finally formally adopt the recommendations of the Charlotte Redevelopment Commission and then to submit their final plans to the Federal Urban Renewal Administration. The vote in council chambers was really just a formal step. It was a foregone conclusion, but several people stood to speak in protest anyway. When Martin Waters rose on that January 1960 day, he wanted to offer a last-ditch warning to the all-white city council. Black leaders had protested for a while, but Waters himself was a white man, and he summarized his three strongest arguments against urban renewal in this way. For one, government using eminent domain to take private property is a fundamental wrong against property rights, he said. For two, the federal dollars that were supposed to pay for 75% of the cost of the urban renewal program was a deal that was simply too good to be true. In the end, Charlotte was going to be out far more money than the rosy projections that the Redevelopment Commission was making. And for three, Martin Waters said, many widows whose sole income comes from property within the urban renewal area will be deprived of this income and will be unable to reinvest funds for new property that will obtain a like yield. The condensed version of that last argument sounds like this. Slumlording is profitable. Waters warned that the effect of so-called slum clearance would be to clear out the derelict housing of the area to the detriment of those who owned and profited from it. At no point did city leaders nor real estate agencies who pushed for renewal projects consider policy decisions that would force the owners of dilapidated housing to take responsibility for the conditions that they had created. Nor did they make serious consideration of the effect that urban renewal would have on those whose neighborhoods they were destroying. The situation got so bad here in Charlotte, as in many other places around the country, that in 1962 here, bulldozers were running in the first phases of demolition, and the federal government threatened to cut off Charlotte's funding until the Redevelopment Commission began to take seriously the displacement and the housing crisis that they were creating. We've read from Mark chapter 12 this morning and also briefly from Psalm 118. The key image of Psalm 118 is this cornerstone image. And it becomes not only the key image of that psalm, but in all of the New Testament. It's cited in 1 Peter chapter 2, and also cited in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all in connection to this parable. Only a handful of Old Testament passages, mostly those from the Ten Commandments, are quoted more frequently in the New Testament than this one from Psalm 118. So something important is happening here. The three synoptic gospels offer us a hint for why this passage is cited in connection with this particular parable. Mark says, for example, that the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders, which is to say the religious and cultural authorities, recognize themselves in the story as Jesus tells it. They immediately want Jesus arrested for telling the story against them, though none of the gospel writers make clear what it was they had understood. They only say that the religious elite knew that they did not look good in the telling of this story. Jesus had shown them up. But with Jesus surrounded by a crowd primarily consisting of peasants and outcasts, the rejected and the despised, they dared not move to have him arrested quite yet. The easiest way to read this parable, and by far the most common way for Western, primarily white audiences, is to read it as an allegory. Everything in the story is a symbol for something else in an allegory. God is the landowner, the prophets are the enslaved people, Jesus is the son, and the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders are the wicked tenants who kill the prophets and kill the son and now face the coming wrath of God. But every text has multiple ways in, and if this one suggests an allegory, it also demands a reckoning with the economics of the story. This is especially true because in Mark chapters 11 and 12, we have a series of actions and sayings from Jesus that mash together both criticism of the religious elite and criticism of the economic order of the day. The psalm text that forms the key point to which this parable is working is also an economic and political text. Psalm 118 uses repeated imagery from the domain of landscape and built environment to make plain that the salvation of God has spatial dimensions. The psalm is about places and buildings and cities and city gates, all ways of structuring common life and economic roles. Jesus is telling the story inside the city of Jerusalem, the most important city of his region and his culture. And so we have to read this parable with that urban context in mind. The story begins with the quick characterization of a man. We only learn a handful of things about him, but they're enough to give us an idea of what we ought to think. For one, he is quite wealthy. He planted a vineyard, which is the most expensive and intensive kind of planting you can do. He then built a fence around the vineyard against the instructions of Leviticus to leave the edges of a field open and to keep the gleanings of a harvest available so that the poor could access them. He built the infrastructure for winemaking, which is another capital-intensive investment, a lengthy process that makes money after years, not just weeks. And then he built a watchtower, a security system, presumably to protect his investments against anyone who would come against him. And finally, having scratched his itch, he leaves the country. He doesn't even stick around to get the fruit of his labor. He makes himself an absentee landlord. In other words, he's rich, fabulously so. He's the sort of guy who builds vanity projects, the ancient Near Eastern equivalent of riding a phallus to the edge of outer space. And you don't have to read too far into the Gospels to understand that this is not a good thing. Indeed, for an audience of Palestinian peasants subjected to Roman imperial rule, the hearers of this parable would not have been likely to sympathize with an absentee landlord. They would have known the plight of tenant farmers all too well, to work long hours from can see to can't see, as Black Southern sharecroppers and enslaved people used to say, only then to have the work of your hands taken from you. And that characterization of the wealthy man turns this little parable upside down. It domesticates it. It challenges it only being an allegory. The action that follows sounds different if you read it from the underside, as though the primary listeners were an exploited working class. The absentee landlord wants the profits that he thinks are his. So he sends enslaved people, which is to say, he sends those who shared the most in common with the tenant farmers, but did the work of the absentee landlord anyway. So the tenants heaped scorn upon them and even killed them in some cases. Then the absentee landlord sent his son, the heir to the farm. The tenants see an opportunity to seize what they perceive to be rightly theirs, namely the land that they have worked and fertilized and harvested, only to have it taken away by a wealthy guy who never shows up. So they kill the son. Now, we might criticize, perhaps encourage them that maybe killing the son is not the best way to handle this situation, but the parables sometimes use big characters and dramatic actions to drive home the point, so we'll go with it. Now the story shifts slightly. It's set up like a classic joke in the form of same, and then different. In the first two movements, the action focuses on what the tenant farmers will do. But in the third movement, Jesus changes the subject of the action. Now it is the absentee landlord's actions that we are to notice. What's he going to do? Well, he will come and destroy the tenants and remove them from the land. It's not a question, it seems to be a foregone conclusion. I think it is worth asking why such a shift would happen. Why does the focus of the story change? What could we learn from that? And one answer to that question, I believe, is that Jesus is making plain the inherent violence of a system of landlording and tenancy, especially when it is done in a way not aimed at meeting human need, but instead aimed at turning profit. It is important for Jesus to turn the focus on the rich landowner to show that his actions are and have been exploitative from the beginning. They will continue to be so, we can presume, until he finds tenants who will not question his right to collect from the tenants' labor. Remember, we began with a characterization of this man who is wealthy and who stands in clear violation of Torah against the well-being of his community. With that in mind, the quotation from Psalm 118 begins to sound a little different. The verse says, "The stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes." If we can resist the allegorical reading and hold to a plainer reading for a few more moments, it begins to make even more sense. Who is the builder in this parable? Why, it is the landowner who builds a fence and a wine press and a security system. And who is it that the builder rejected? Well, it is the workers who work the land that he abandoned and yet were not able to profit from their own labor. What is happening in this parable is not only an interpretation of the life of Jesus in relation to the religious authorities. What is also happening is the invocation of a new set of economic relations that places laborers and workers in the position to profit from the labor that they do. It is worth remembering that to some extent, those same religious authorities often cooperated with Roman occupiers of their territory. An entire system of absentee landlords and exploitative contracts and the disrespect of labor and the prioritization of those who make money without laboring is at its root violent, this text is suggesting, and it requires a differently ordered economic world. Those differing relations are not figurative. Psalm 118 continually appeals to the spatial dimensions of God's salvation, which is why quoting that text in the context of a story about landlords and workers makes so much sense. And that sense transfers well into our own society with its disordered economic relations, with our beliefs and myths like meritocracy and equality of opportunity. Though Americans love those myths, a very different reality has been concretized into our cities. We have not built for equity, not even for equality. We have constructed segregation, ghettos of wealth and greed surrounded by vast swaths of disinvestment that are now becoming sites of rapid displacement in our urban areas. We live in a new gilded age where access to basic goods and infrastructure like groceries and sidewalks and quality health care and decent housing is only available to a smaller and smaller portion of our society. There are increasing numbers of wine presses and watchtowers, massive developments owned by a small number of elites, and large masses of the displaced with no chance at using the work of their own hands to build the wealth they need for basic sustenance. These economic results are built into our spatial relations. Our cities are constructed around architectures of segregation. I cited urban renewal earlier, but it was only one strategy for cementing unjust racial and economic relations into our very city building plans. Even today, small efforts to undo just a sliver of the damage wrought by policies like urban renewal are met with great resistance. We have legal codes that have allowed Wall Street firms to become the most active home and land buyers in Mecklenburg County, where I live, and in numerous other urban counties around the country. Pretty much no one thinks this is a good idea. But policy efforts that would make greater changes, like adopting a reparations framework for dealing with the legacy of urban renewal, seem well nigh impossible. We know that absentee landlords harm neighborhoods, but no one is willing to give even a single inch of property rights to change our practices around private property, even though we know the current order is deeply unjust. We could very well give the land back to the communities from whom it was taken, but the power of our unjust social relations is strong. Jesus assumes, as does his audience, that the cost of changing those power relations will be unquenchable violence by those who hold property. Psalm 118's proposition is radical then. It asks us to build in literal fashion around an unusual set of principles, to build spaces for thriving, to build so that labor is shared and that the fruits of our labors are shared. It asks us to fundamentally reimagine the spatial orientations of our cities, in their traffic and transportation patterns, in their housing and education policies, so that the ones thought to be weak and forgotten among us become the strong foundation of our communities. Their flourishing will be our flourishing. And in a society where land relations are built along a system of white supremacy, the first and foremost means will require us tearing down a culture built on anti-Black racism. But it extends beyond that to those others rejected in our culture, those who are trans, those who are queer, those who live with disabilities, those for whom American culture does not and has never worked. And yet, kindred, should we become so bold, we would have much cause for celebration. The psalm frames that celebration in this way, and Jesus quotes it to us. He says, "This will be the Lord's doing, and it will be marvelous in our eyes." In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, may it be so.